I want to share with you a couple of quick stories from my life. They're two stories that I think illustrate pretty well what grace is and what it is not. The first of these stories occurred when I was, I'm guessing, 13 years old. I know that my parents were out of town, and I had been signed up to attend an etiquette class with many of my classmates. We learned a few dances and the basics of dining, and we learned how to escort and date of the opposite sex, all those really important things in life. So the time for our first class came, and I was told only that I should wear a collared shirt. To me, that meant a polo shirt with a collar on it. Besides, this was Oklahoma, and it was probably July or August. As I said, my parents were out of town, so a friend's mother picked me up for the carpool to the country club where these classes were being held. We all gathered, probably 40 kids, and as the class began, my clothing attracted the attention of the teacher. Apparently, my choice of shirt was unacceptable. I needed a button-down shirt. And the teacher informed me that the sandals I was wearing were unfit for dancing. So a complete stranger was selected to drive me 30 minutes back to my home where I could change clothes and then return to the class when properly attired. I was embarrassed and I was angry. My time had been wasted, and all by a woman who was enlisted to teach me appropriate etiquette. I will never forget the profound irony of that experience and the way I learned exactly who I did not want to be in the world. That was a day lacking in anything that I would call grace. The other story that I have to share with you is a very simple one. It's not much of a story, really. It's more of a moment. One of the most memorable meals of my life was in the Peace Corps. I talked about it last week. I guess it's on my mind. In West Africa, where I was a volunteer, men ate their meals together, and they ate first. I'm not certain of this, but it seemed that women and children usually ate what was left over. I don't exactly know that because I'd never ate with them. One evening, I was preparing to eat dinner alone at my house in the village. This was rare because I usually ate with neighbors. Well, that night, I had one dinner guest. He was a 6-year-old boy named Quam. Although we shared no common language, we became good friends. We walked through the village together nearly every afternoon. So that one night, we shared a meal. I think it was ramen noodles and some canned spinach mixed in. I didn't quite know how to deal with the local ingredients that were available. So we shared a meal sitting on wooden stools on my front porch, breaking every social norm of my culture and his. We shared a meal and slurped our noodles in grace. So this morning we're talking about social graces, the way we treat one another and the way our culture expects people to behave toward one another. There are some generally acknowledged rules, but this is also a very personal thing. The things that bug you the most are likely different from the things that bug me. To really get at this morning's message, I want you to keep in mind a couple of those personal pet peeves. What are the few rude things that people do that really bother you? Maybe it's not saying thank you, or not offering to open the door, or chewing with their mouths open, or bringing up taboo topics in polite conversation. We usually have a couple of those pieces of manners that get at us. The other thing I want to ask you to keep in mind is, how do you like to be treated? What makes you feel like someone has respected you personally? And keep those questions in mind. These details are different person to person, but what bad manners annoy you, and how do you hope to be treated? We can think of social graces as a piece of culture. We can also think of it as a form of communication between people. Manners are a set of ways of acting that we use to show respect, or in some cases, I guess, disrespect for others. The words we choose, the way we hold our bodies, the way we enter a room, the way we sit, all of those little details are pieces of communication. And a very simple way of understanding communication is that person A says what they want to convey to person B, and person B hears what person A has said and understands. Wouldn't that be a lovely and simple world if that's how it worked? We all know communicating an idea, at least one with any complexity, is more nuanced than that. We don't usually have the perfect language to express our thoughts, and sometimes it's difficult to understand what someone else is getting at. Even when we try to be as clear and concise as we can, communication can be messy business. Person A wants to get a specific message to person B, so to do that, person A selects the words and the way of expressing those words that person B most likely understands. Communication isn't just about saying what you want to say. There are choices involved. We choose the words that we use and the way we say them, depending on who we're trying to speak to. And we choose the way that we use our bodies and our social graces depending on whom we're trying to communicate with. I've gone through this elaborate explanation of communication to make 2 points. One is that it's a simple choice to respect or to attempt to engage the language of the person that you're spending time with. We may not succeed, but showing an effort goes a long, long way. And the second point is, no matter how hard we try, sometimes we won't succeed in that communication. Because in the end, we all expect slightly different things. We all know that between different cultures, social graces are different. Even within a single culture, expectations change from generation to generation. We've seen that for sure. Still, in the midst of all that uncertainty and difference, we can make an effort. So there's more to this conversation than using the correct fork or opening the door or standing to greet someone. Manners and social graces have a much bigger impact than individual relationships. They can have huge impact on the way we interact on a larger scale. 2 men of American history seem to embody this reality. The impact of their understanding of manners and social graces meant the difference between harmonious encounters and cultural genocide. The 2 men that I'm speaking of were Benjamin Franklin and Captain Richard Pratt. Benjamin Franklin knew that every culture had its own etiquette, and by appreciating one another's social graces, we might better understand one another. As I was researching this sermon, I was absolutely stunned by the perspective of Franklin that he brought on these cross-cultural communications with American Indians. He details some of those differences in our writings and explains why their social practices in many ways were more respectful and more humane than the colonizers. I first started reading his essay. It's titled, "Remarks Concerning the Savage of North America." I was expecting a big old pile of arrogance and ignorance, I found the opposite, though. Franklin wrote, "Savages we call them because their manners differ from ours, which we think the perfection of civility. They think the same of theirs." I love that quote because it's so on target and such a recipe for conflict. Savages we call them because their manners differ from ours, which we think the perfection of civility. They think the same of theirs. He knew that American Indians simply acted out of a different set of cultural norms. And within their own norms, there was a meaningful and loving way to express human relationship and order. He respected those differences deeply. I want to compare that with Captain Richard Pratt, the man associated with the efforts of building American Indian boarding schools. We still call them boarding schools. This is one of those often ignored important pieces of American history. In 1875, Captain Richard Pratt took 72 Indian warriors suspected of murdering white settlers to Fort Marison in St. Augustine, Florida. And there he began this experiment that involved teaching these young Indians to read and write English and putting them in uniforms and drilling them like soldiers. His theory was that you could civilize these Indians with this strict motto. It was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." From that point on, a whole network of camps was created to do just that. This federally sponsored program lasted for 5 consecutive generations from 1880 to 1980. American Indian culture was systematically stamped out through boarding schools, set up to kill the Indian and save the man. All this talk about social graces has more impact than selecting the correct fork to use for a fancy dinner. It has meant life and death for some people. It's a lens through which some have seen an array of beautiful contrasts and variety, and where others have seen hate and fear. Remember, this month we're talking about the theological theme of grace. Not dancing or being a debutante. We're talking about grace as the unearned gifts from the universe that make everything okay. Grace is relief. Some talk about it as salvation or forgiveness. Grace gives us strength and power to heal ourselves. And nearly every religious tradition has some concept of grace. In Buddhism, some believe in bodhisattvas, or beings who have already achieved their enlightenment but relinquish it to stick around here with us humans to help us on our way. Within Hindu traditions, an array of gods and goddesses are available for special favors. And just about every religious tradition I know of has some concept of angels or ghosts or ancestors who help us along this messed up journey of life. Regardless of where you live or what you believe in, there's always something out there that's available to bring some relief and comfort to this life. These angels and favors from God or gods, all of this divine intervention brings comfort and solace. And comfort, to me, is the only type of grace worth having. I want you now to think back to that question that I asked about the social grace that you appreciated or even expected. What was it that made you feel welcomed and comfortable as a person? I'm guessing it wasn't a huge deal. It's something that anyone in this room could do for you. if they knew what you wanted. But more importantly, the feeling of comfort and support are not so different from the feeling of comfort and support that come from religious ideas of grace. The theological concept of grace and the social concept of grace are actually pretty similar. It reminds me of a woman that I knew from the Laguna Beach congregation. She was a historian, and like a lot of academic jobs, you kind of have to follow the job because they're few and far between. She found herself cast into the middle of the country in a very rural setting. During those years, she developed a habit of cooking delicious food. And to keep the loneliness at bay, she cooked wonderful food and had dinner parties nearly every week for her friends. Over time, this cadre of close friends developed. But for one of those guests, those connections essentially saved her life. One of the members of that circle eventually became mentally ill. For years, she struggled with unemployment and poverty and near homelessness due to her challenges. She had no family left, but that circle of friends that grew out of shared meals continued to be her safety net. They've literally kept her going for decades. At those dinner parties, in those relationships, there was grace abundant. The grace was not in the correct folding of linen napkins, but in the network of love and support that grew out of shared times together. Human connections can save souls. Making the time and effort to be together, offering grace to one another, can save souls. Real social grace, like theological grace, makes us feel safe and secure. Real social grace, at least the kind worth having, is about recognizing and celebrating a whole person and making them feel welcome and heard. Social grace is about building a beloved community, building a place where all are welcome and all are heard. And that invitation to the beloved community doesn't require anyone to send an RSVP ahead of time. Amen.